Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Leigh Fuge, and in this video today, we're going to build a pedal board. So in my hands, I've got this Pedal Train Classic 2, and we're going to put this together with a bunch of pedals and talk about the build process. So in the video, we're going to cover how to prep your board, how to power your board, what kind of order to put your pedals in, what type of patch cables to use, and a bunch of other pedal related topics. So before we do that, I do have to say I'm not getting paid for this video, but my buddies at Pedal Train have given me this Pedal Train Classic 2, and there are also going to be some other pedals featured in the video that are going to go on this board that I have been given by some friends in other companies. So the first thing to talk about is choosing a pedal board. Now, the Pedal Train Classic 2 isn't the biggest one in the range, but it's a good size. It's a pretty versatile, standard sized board. You know, if you're a gigging or touring musician, a board like this is going to get you a lot of pedals to get through a show. Now, you can get some smaller boards. Pedal Train have much more compact boards in their range. So when it comes to choosing your first board, a great way to do this is to lay all the pedals out that you plan to put on the board, measure the area that they sit in, check that against the Pedal Train website or whichever other brand you go with, and then you will obviously find the right size board for your needs. Pedal Train pretty much have everything from these mini boards which hold 3 or 4 pedals right up to boards that are probably nearly twice the size of this thing in front of me. So there's definitely plenty of real estate to go around. So once you've measured up and chosen your board, then you need to prep it. So I've actually done most of the prep work already because some of that stuff is a little bit boring to watch. So what I've done is I've added the Velcro on top already. You don't have to cover the entire top of the board if you don't want to, but I like to chop and change things regularly, so I like to just coat the top of the board in the Velcro. It makes my life a bit easier. And also when you're mounting a pedal power supply underneath, you do have to drill some holes. So I've actually mounted one of the brackets here already because I messed up the drilling, surprise, surprise, and I had to basically bend this into shape to make it fit. So I've already pre-fixed that one, but I will put the other one on when we fit the power supply. You do have to drill into the bottom of a Pedal Train, unfortunately. There's no other way to mount the brackets, but these are the official Pedal Train brackets for the power supply that I'm going to be using. So whatever power supply you do choose, they will probably have a set of brackets to fit that supply. So once the board is prepped, it's going to look like this. So it's currently a blank canvas. Now the first thing I am going to do is I am going to install my power supply underneath the board before I do anything else. So the power supply I've decided is going to go in this corner. You may notice I've put some of these little sticky pads on, which are basically cable tie holders. So when I'm running my cables, I can make it nice and neat. I'm going to be putting more of these on as we go through the video as well. Power supply I'm going to be using is the Walrus Audio Phoenix. Now this is a pretty high output power supply. It's got a lot of outputs because I'm going to be using quite a few pedals. This really works for me because it's got 2 outputs that I can switch between 9 and 12 volts and one I can switch between 9 and 18. It's also got some 300 milliamp outputs here and a bunch of 100 milliamp outputs. So it's definitely enough juice for what I need. You could probably get away with a smaller one if you're not going to be using as many pedals. When you are choosing a power supply, the amount it can output is very, very important. So check all your pedals, check the manuals and check the stickers on the back for the milliamp output. You want to add all of this up, the total number of milliamps, make sure the power supply can give that total amount, because otherwise you're not going to be getting enough juice to your pedals. So this is going to go underneath the pedal board here. So the output is going to be on the back, so I can plug a cable straight to the back of the board. This is going to live here underneath this bracket that I've pre-bent, very badly I might add. So I'm just going to force that in there, and that's going to hold it in place. Now there is a pair of brackets, so I'm going to be putting the second bracket on, and that's going to be going here. This one has been drilled better, so this one will actually just go on quite easily. So I'm just going to get the screws for that in, and then that is all there is to mounting the power supply. Obviously a big part of this was drilling the holes. So if you are doing this for the first time, you will actually have to add the holes to your Pedal Train because they won't be there out of the box. Okay, so that is mounted. That's not going anywhere. So that's perfect in that place because I can just run all my cables from the underside of the board, and these are going to help guide the cables when I'm ready to power it up. All right, so the board is prepped, the power supply is installed. The next step now is to install the pedals. But before we do that, I'm just going to take a moment to basically talk to you guys about some best practices when it comes to signal chain building. So when you're building a pedal board, there are really no rules. You can put the pedals in whatever order that suits you. But there are some basic principles that it's quite useful to follow if you want to guarantee your board is going to work in the way that you intend it to. So the idea is to make sure that all the pedals interact in the most natural way possible. Now you can come up with some really cool textures and sounds by mixing this rule up and trying different things. But as a starting point, if you've never built a board before, here's a good place to start. So right at the front of the chain, you would put things that either like to see the guitar signal, like certain fuzz pedals will only like to see the guitar signal direct in. Things like a guitar tuner, which again works best if it's seeing the direct guitar signal, and things like a wah pedal. Anything like that, fuzz wah or a tuner, the closer to the front of the chain you can get that, the better. Then the second stage of the chain would be for things like compression pedals, or maybe a clean boost if you've got a pedal that's always on and you like the sound of that as your basic tone. Next is a good place to put them. The third stage would be where you put your pitch-based effects. This is also interchangeable with the second stage, so again, just down to how you want the signal flow. If you use pitch-based effects like a POG or a harmonizer type pedal, the closer to the input guitar signal you can put them, the better, because again, they're working with a clean signal. If you run these effects after your drive section, it can provide some really cool results, but you will not get the cleanest signal tracking. So the closer they are to the input clean guitar signal, the more clear they're going to track and the more accurate your pitch changes will be. Then you move into the drive section of the board. Now compressors can kind of go anywhere in the front half of the board. I find I like them personally if I use them towards the front where they're dealing again with that clean guitar signal, but they can sit very nicely in the drive section too. When it comes to a drive section, I always stack my drives lowest gain to highest gain in order of use that way. So the lower gain ones will be at the front and the higher gain ones will be at the back. So when you're stacking drive pedals, it's very, very important to remember that the pedals will react differently depending on which order you put them in. If you put a cleaner boost into a more gainy pedal, you're going to boost the gain of the second pedal. It's going to hit the input harder and provide more gain and saturation. If you put a cleaner boost after a drive pedal that's already saturated, you're going to increase the volume, but not necessarily the gain. As a general rule of thumb, the pedal that is last in the stack of whatever you've got switched on will be the overall tone, and the other pedals will kind of input their own flavor on that output tone. So if you've got a tube screamer last and you run 3 or 4 different pedals in front of it, it's still going to sound like a tube screamer, but with these additional flavors come in. But if you put something like a Boss DS1 at the end of the chain and you push a tube screamer into that, it's going to sound like a DS1, but with a tube screamer flavor added to it. So there's no real rules that are set in stone for this kind of thing. Whatever order your drive pedals sound the best to you is the right way to go. Coming out of the drive section, I find the best thing to go into next is your modulation. So if you're using things like choruses, phasers, flanges, vibratos, anything that modulates the pitch or the tone of the guitar, this is a great place to put it. You can put these before your drive section if you like to add drive to the modulated sound, but the way I like to do it is I like to modulate the driven sound. The signal flow is very important to remember, because wherever you put things impacts how they sound, because different things happen at different points of the chain. From the modulation section, I always run into a delay section because I find that that's the best place for it. I like my delays to be quite close to the end. And then the final stage is the reverb. Now reverb is an effect you don't want to put too early in your chain, because reverb essentially is a fake space that you're putting your guitar sound into. So imagine you put your reverb pedal at the start of your chain. You're putting your dry guitar signal straight into that reverb space, then you're running it through everything else. So if your reverb space is then running through your overdrive pedals, you're actually overdriving the sound of the space. If you flip this on its head and you put the reverb last, what you're then doing is you're taking all of your tone and putting that into a space. So the closer to the end of the chain the reverb is, the better. I think it really does work best at the end of the chain if you're going to use one. You can also put things like modulations, delays, and reverbs in the effects loop of your amplifier. This does change the way they interact with the amp as well. They go after the preamp circuit, so it's a different tonal characteristic. I personally prefer to just run everything in the front. For me, that always works best. But try it, experiment, and see which way sits best for your own rig. So now let's put this thing together. Okay, so now we've got a blank canvas to work with. with a mounted power supply underneath. So whenever I'm building a board, the first thing I always do is I just imagine the layout. So I always like my input point to be in the top corner here on the right side and my output point to be on the top left corner. So I already know my input is going to be my Boss TU2, so that's going to go right there. I like to get it right up to the edge on a pedal train because it doesn't really matter, because there's not going to be a cable coming on this side, so that can get mounted as close to the edge as I can get it. And my output is going to be my TC Electronics Hall of Fame Mini, which is going to go in this corner, so that's going to go there. So now I have my in and my out, so now I need to fill in the gaps. So whenever I build a board, I like to have things in a practical order. So closest to my tuner, I like to have things that are on all the time or things I don't use as much. So the first thing I'm going to put down is going to be the J-Rocket Lenny. This is going to be a clean boost that I'm going to use either as an always on kind of thing or just a general tone coloration pedal. So it's probably not going to get switched on or off too much. It's probably going to be on all the time. So I want that to go here because that's just out of the way. I'm not going to need to access that one too much. Just make sure it's on the rails properly. So then the way that I would structure things is coming out of whatever my clean boost is, I like to hit my fuzz pedals. Most fuzz pedals tend to like to be quite early on in the chain. So the fuzz I'm going to be using is the Tate FX Raise the Dead. This is the germanium one. Germanium fuzz pedals usually don't like to be anything other than first in the chain, but this particular one actually is okay to go after other pedals, so it's going to live there. Now again, fuzz isn't an effect that lives on all the time for me, so the fact that it's out of the way is fine. I'm just going to be kicking that on from time to time. Coming out of the Raise the Dead is going to be the Beatronics Octahive. This is a octave up fuzz. It also has a regular fuzz mode built in, but I only really use this for the octave up. It's based on the Tycho Brahe Octavia. This is probably the best one I've ever tried that gets closest to the original sound. I used to use the Voodoo Labs Proctavia, which I thought was awesome, but when I tried this, that really kind of took it to another level. So that's going to go next to the Raise the Dead. Now I've already kind of mapped this out in my mind where I want this to go, so I'm not just throwing the pedals on at random. I've sort of thought about this a little bit already. Next in the chain is going to be my TC Electronics Sub and Up. This is sort of TC Electronics' take on the POG. It's a polyphonic pitch generator, so I can use like a octave or 2 octaves down and an octave up. This is great for some different interesting textures with your playing, so that is going to go there. Now at this point, all of these things are things that I'm just going to be switching on and off sporadically as I play. They're not going to be all on. Maybe this is going to be on all the time, but these are more just lead guitar textures, and this is just something I use for a bit of fun. So at this point, I want to route now down to the front end of the board, and this is where all my main pedals are going to be that I use all the time. So this is where I'm going to be doing some gain stacking. Now, when you use different gain pedals, and I like to use a few different overdrives at once, you can really get different textures based on what order you put them in. Now this is completely experimental, and it's something that you can really spend, you know, hours and hours playing around with. So I have an order that I like to use. I always like to go from lowest gain to highest gain, but again, you can do this whichever way you want. The way you stack these will impact how they interact with each other. So the first thing I'm going to put right at the start of the board is my Cheritone Centura. Now this is obviously a Klon Centaur style pedal. This is pretty big and it does take up a lot of real estate on the board, but you know, it sounds so good that I don't mind giving up a bit more space for this thing. So this is going to go right here at the start. This one is one that I do use a lot. I will be switching this on and off, and this is one I actually change the controls a lot for as well. So I will use this from everything from a clean boost to a moderate sort of gain level. So it being there is cool because it can kind of affect the stuff that comes after it. Then coming out of the Cheritone Centura is going to be the Analog Man King of Tone. This is one of my favorite drive pedals. I waited about 3.5 years on the waiting list for this, and it was worth it. So this one I actually had modded by Analog Man. So I've got the standard gain mode on the yellow side and the high gain mode on the red side. So that's going to come right there after the Centura. Make sure that's on there good. Coming out of the Analog Man King of Tone, I'm going to have the Chevtone Messiah Drive. This is sort of like a Marshall Plexi / Marshall Blues Breaker in a box. Great kind of mid-pushed, sort of throaty British overdrive. It can go up to some higher gain stuff, which is useful, like sort of JCM 800 type stuff. So that's going to go there. So when I play live, I like to stack drives to get different textures. So the way I would set this up at this stage is that I have my Centura on a sort of crunchy, just broken up kind of tone. That would run then into my King of Tone. This side of the King of Tone, which is the one that's been modded with a high gain mod, this would be set just higher than this. So this kind of lifts the gain. This side, the yellow side, I would either have at a sort of bluesy crunch or just like a lead boost kind of thing. Then I'd have my Messiah Drive being a bit more gain. Coming out of the Messiah Drive, I'm going to have the MXR Timmy. Now this part of my board, the Messiah and the Timmy, is probably where I'm going to be doing a lot of swaps. So this is a sort of open-ended bit of the board. The Timmy is just another sort of higher gain texture that I really like. And coming out with the Timmy, another gain pedal, the TC Electronics Spark Mini. This is a clean boost, 20 dB. That's going to be used for leads. So that's going to go there. So when I want to lift the level of everything to play solos, that's the pedal I'm going to hit. So this is my gain stacking section. So there's 5 different gain pedals there, which some people may find is a little bit excessive, but I'm not really the biggest modulation or delay player. So for me, gain pedals are really what I like to use, and they're really where I like to get a lot of my sound. So coming out of my gain section, we are going to go now into my modulation section. So my modulation pedal is the Boss MD200. This has like, is it 12 or 14 different modulation effects, from chorus, flanger, rotary. There's like something on there that sounds a bit like a keyboard. There's a tremolo, there's a vibrato. This is all the modulation I need, and you can have a bunch of presets. So that's literally the only thing I would ever need in the modulation realm right there. I do have to put this at the front of the board. I would usually put things like that at the back, but the design of this actually tilts down at the front. So this doesn't actually sit too well on the back row of a pedal train, because those buttons actually tilt sort of into the back of the pedals in front. So this does need to be on the front. Would be nice to see a revised version of this from Boss with the pedal buttons actually at a higher place, so you could actually get to them if they were behind other things. But for now, it can live right there. And the final thing I'm going to add is the Walrus Audio Mako D1. Now again, not the biggest delay player. I don't use a ton of delay, but this is, you know, 9 presets in a box with a tap tempo switch. This is all the delay I can ever need. So that will go right there. So there's my rough layout. So now I'm just gonna make sure that I've got everything evenly spaced, because I do like a neat looking pedal board. I like to see even spacing between things. So that looks about right to me. I could probably tuck the King of Tone in a bit more to get a bit more space here. But that looks pretty good. So now we're going to talk about patch cables. So I prefer patch cables with pancake style jacks, which are these style. They're very flat, very low profile. This means if you're cramming a lot of pedals together, there's not anything sticking out which is causing any bulk between the pedals. So I'm going to be using a combination of these Eminence plugs, which are made up on Van Damme cable. I think I've got some Mogami cables somewhere as well. I've also got some of these Tortec patch cables that my friends at PMT sent me, both the big style and some smaller style pancake jack ones as well. So I'm going to cable all this up now. So when I'm cabling a board, I like to keep the runs as short as possible. So I know here I'm going from the TU2 into the Leigh, so I don't want to be using, you know, a foot long of cable. I'm going to use a 6-inch cable. So that's going to go from the output of the TU2 into the input of the Leigh. The Leigh having its jacks on the back is a little fiddly, because you do have to kind of work them in a bit to get them neat. But once they're in, it's all good. The Leigh is then going to go into the Raise the Dead, which again is a short patch cable, so I don't need any excess cable kicking around there. I think I can use another short cable to run into the Octahive. That doesn't need to be anything too long. Just need to be mindful that the Octahive does have a little switch on the side to switch between the fuzz and octave mode, which I will use from time to time, but it'll mostly live on the octave mode. Another short cable from the Octahive to the TC. So it's mostly short cables at this point. I like to keep the runs as short as possible, but at this point, I now need to change that. So when I was putting the board together, you may remember I said I'm going to run the sub and up down to the clon. So I've actually got this extra long patch cable here, which is going to do that job for me. So I'm going to plug that to the output of the sub and up, and then that is going to run down here into the input of the clon. Now, that cable is not just going to be flapping around. I am going to put that through one of the little cable tie hooks underneath to keep it neat. Now I can revert back to some short cables, so we can go from the clon into King of Tone into the Messiah drive, the Messiah drive into the Timmy, the Timmy into the Spark, Spark into the MD200. So I've been pretty lucky so far that even though I am using a lot of pedals, all of my cable lines are pretty short so far, and that is looking pretty good, pretty neat. So now I just need to use one of these slightly longer Tortec cables to come up to my Mako D1. So what I do have the option of doing here is I can actually turn this into a stereo rig if I want. The MD200 has a stereo out, as does the D1. I can either run stereo here by putting a right angle cable here and running that to a separate amp, or I could move my Hall of Fame slightly so I could get to the dual outs of this. For now, I'm just going to set it up in mono. So again, nice short cable runs. I'm not too fussed on the stereo thing. I don't use it too often. I mostly use stereo as a way to split amp signals rather than actual stereo effects. So for now, as a mono pedal board, that is cabled up. Right, so now it's time to power the board up. Now, before you start powering it up, check which pedals need some additional output. So most of these pedals are pretty low usage. The only things here that are going to need a bit of extra juice are the MD200 and the D1 Mako. They both need 300 milliamps. Everything else can survive off 100. I believe even the TC Hall of Fame can take 100 as well, but I will check that. Most of the manufacturers' websites will have that information. So remember the position of the things that need to go to the slightly higher outputs. Everything else is fine. So the Walrus Audio actually comes with two different power cable lengths. You actually get some long power cables, and you also get some short power cables. Now this is important because you don't want to run your long cables from the power supply, which is there, to the pedals on top, and try and stretch your short ones all the way down here. So you do have to do a little bit of planning. But again, like anything, if you think about it and you plan it out, it will run pretty smooth. So I'm going to flip the board over now. So here is where things can get a bit messy. So I've got this long cable here just flapping around. So I'm going to set up a neat cable run for this to go through. So I'm just going to put this through there and pull it slightly. I'm not going to pull it all the way tight, just enough to hold things in place. Okay, so now let's start powering all of the other pedals up. So I find that the Phoenix is actually pretty tight to work with because we've got these two rows here. So I'm actually going to start from the bottom row, make sure everything's switched to 9 volts because I'm not using anything more than that. So I'm going to start from my bottom row here with my 9 volt pedals. I'm going to save my higher output ones for later on in the process. So I'm going to go this way. We're going to have another run here and another one down here. I will also probably add some more as I go along just to make sure things are neat. So this is going to power the Timmy, the Boost, which is the TC Spark Boost, and probably the Chev Tone. I'll run all those this direction. And then I'm going to use my final short cable on another 100 milliamp output just to power my Hall of Fame. So as you can see, this gets pretty messy pretty quick. This is why the cable ties are important, because obviously we can neaten all this up as we go along. So now I need to power the other side of the board. So this is where the slightly longer cables are going to come in. Even though I don't need all the longer cables, I actually have another shorter one here, which is good because that can power the sub and up. You can see how this could easily become tangled and very messy because obviously we're running a lot of cables in a very tight space. So there are many guys out there who will run their board cables super tight and super clean. I'm not going to be going for anything overly clean here, purely because this board is always going to be chopped and changed depending on what I need from it. So if I'm doing certain gigs or certain gear demos, I always want to be able to take things on and off very easily. So to commit to a layout that's too tight is actually not a good idea for me, because it will always mean that I've got to take something apart, which, as we all know, is never ideal. So I think that is that half of the board cabled. So now we've got to move on to the 5 remaining pedals here and the tuner. Now what I am going to do, and this is something I've done forever, is I'm going to run this cable off the TU2 actually has an output, a power output that I can run into another pedal. So I always do this just because it saves me running another cable somewhere. So I'm going to run the Leigh off the same power supply that the TU2 is going to be on, just because it's going to be very low output anyway. So I'm just going to get that in there, and I will deal with the neatness of that cable later on. So now let's start cabling this in, and I think we'll work from the TU2 backwards. So the TU2 doesn't need anything special, just standard 100 volt or 100 milliamp I should say. So let's get that in. I'm actually going to use these same cable runs here, and then where do we want to go? There's always a bit of planning with this kind of thing. So I'm actually then going to come, maybe I'll come back down this middle run. Just wondering if there's a way we can make this even neater. Let's go with that for now. Okay, so the TU2 is plugged in. Then the Tate Raise the Dead. Again, doesn't need much because it's a fuzz pedal, so let's just get that cable in. Then the Octahive next. So another one to the top of the board. Now at this point I just need to go here, so I'm probably going to take another one of these little sticky pads. You can get these on Amazon in bags of like 100, and I'm just going to stick one of them on the top row here, just so I've got a place to put my cable neatly. And then the only ones left to power are the King of Tone and the Klon, I believe. So the Klon does actually need a special power adapter, which I have here somewhere. It doesn't run off your standard barrel jack, it actually runs off like a headphone style power output. So I've got that, which is going to get plugged in, and then that is going to get run under the board. Okay, so I'm actually going to change that cable. Even though that's a short cable, I'm going to change that for a longer one, because the Klon's power output is actually really close to its output jack. So I need a little bit more cable flex there just to allow me to get in nice and tight. So those two now need some power. Okay, so now we need to neaten this up a little bit. So here's where we just start pulling things tight and making sure that everything is nice and uniform. So I'm not going to be too neat. Like I said, there's plenty of guys out there who are going to be way neater with this kind of thing than I am, because I don't really need the neatest pedal board. I just need a functional pedal board. So my board doesn't have to be super clean or super tight. And then just trim the ends off and we should have a relatively neat pedal board. So there are a couple of places I could do this a little bit neater, but I'm not going to worry about that too much at this point. As long as it's functional, I can always add more little cable tie runs later on just to keep it neat. So there's a couple of spots where that isn't super clean, but you know, like I said, I'm not going for the cleanest board, I'm just going for a functional board. So I just need to find somewhere to hide this cable. So I'm just going to actually run this into the gap in the middle. So I'm probably going to add more cable tie runs later on just to keep it, you know, a little bit cleaner, but I don't want it super tight because I still want to be able to move things and take things on and off the board. So now I just need to plug it in and make sure everything powers up. In theory, it should. So this looks pretty promising. The tuner turns on, the Leigh, the Raise the Dead, the Beatronics Octahive, the Klon, the King of Tone, the Chev Tone, the Timmy, the Spark, the MD200, 7-Up, the Mako, and the Hall of Fame. Everything works. Now we're going to take a listen to it. So I'm just going to dial in some of my favorite settings and then I'll just play a bit so you can hear what this thing sounds like. All right, so let's take a listen to how the finished board sounds. I'm going to be using my Vola Oz ROA. This is quite a versatile guitar. It's got a humbucker and 2 singles. This is plugged through the pedal board that you see in front of you into the Blackstar Studio 10 6L6, which is mic'd with a Lewitt Audio LCT 440 condenser mic, and there is some spring reverb coming from the Surfy Bear Classic, which is on top of the amplifier. Even though I've got an additional reverb on the board, I'm using the spring reverb tank. This is more of a textural reverb, but it's also going to be used when I'm not taking my full spring reverb tank to gigs. So this is a great mini option. So I'm going to start from the top. So obviously the first thing is the TU2. You don't really need to know what that sounds like because it's just a tuner. My guitar should be in tune. It is in tune, so that's a good sign, so I don't need to check the TU2. So here's just the straight signal from the amp. This is with the Surfy Bear Classic in the front end of the amp, so nothing going through the loop here. So I should also mention, I'm not someone who really bothers with effects loops. I tend to just run everything into the front of the amp. So some of you guys may want to put some of these things like your reverb, your delay, your modulation through the loop of the amp. For me, it's just everything in the front that works best. So the first thing in the chain is the J Rocket Audio Designs Leigh. This is going to be used as my sort of coloration pedal, probably also going to be left on at all times. So here's how this sounds. So you can hear that gives a big volume boost and just a fatness to the amp's default sound. So that's really what I'm going to use that for. It sort of simulates that sort of cranked Stevie Ray Vaughan Dumble thing, just gives a nice roundness to the notes. This now feeds into the Raise the Dead. So everything in this region kind of gets stacked in and out depending on what I'm feeling like. There's a couple of best practices when it comes to stacking gains on volumes and whatnot. We'll get to that in a moment. So here's how this fuzz sounds on its own. I rarely ever use fuzz on its own like that. That is something I only really ever kick on for lead boosts or stacked with another gain pedal. Then we've got the Beatronics Octahive. So this is like an octave up Tycho Brahe type of thing. Not very good with chords, great for some single notes for that kind of Hendrixy thing. This also has its own fuzz. So if I flip the little switch on the side, the LED turns blue, which means it's in fuzz mode. That takes up the octave up circuit. I personally only really use it with the octave up. Really cool, really kind of spluttery and harsh. Sounds even better when you stack it with some gain. Subbing up, this is like my POG kind of thing. Again, doesn't sound like much on its own, but when you start stacking it with things like fuzz, that's where it starts to get a bit more fun. Then we wrote down into the Cheritone Centura. Got this set to sort of a moderate gain. So when you kick that on with single coils, it still cleans up nicely, there's still a lot of clarity there, and then with humbuckers, it just starts to bite. Analog Man King of Tone now, this is the low gain side. Then the high gain side. Now I've actually got the high gain side on its own, set pretty much the same gain wise, but it's actually set a lot darker, as you'll see. The reason for that is because I tend to stack this side with other gain pedals, and obviously I don't want it getting too bright and too harsh. I could also stack both the low gain and high gain side together. Sounds pretty good as well. The Chev Tone Messiah drive, this is the one I said is very kind of martially sounding. Now I do have this one set again quite dark, quite low gain, because again it works really well when you stack things. Just give you a bit of an idea if I brighten this thing up and just crank the gain. It's quite a versatile pedal, but I just like to run it a little bit darker because I like to hit it with other stuff. The Timmy on its own sounds like this. Set a little bit bright, there's almost like a fuzzy characteristic to it. Now this is where we start talking about stacking. So if I was playing a gig, I may do different combinations of things. So I'm just going to play a bit now and flip between these pedals so you can hear. I'll actually switch on the fuzzes as well. So that's a bit of a combination of all of them. I would rarely ever stack all of those together. I'd actually probably be running my fuzz a little hotter as well. So if I was running this into like a kind of boosted Marshall-y thing. Really want that kind of Hendrixy vibe out of that. Obviously it's quite noisy, it's a fuzz, it's meant to be noisy. Then I've got the TC Spark that literally just lifts everything up. So if I'm playing with, you know, this tone and there's a lead break coming up, I'll just hit this. That just makes everything louder. It's also got a really cool sort of momentary thing. So if I just hold that foot switch, it knows when you're trying to turn the pedal on versus when you're just holding it to sort of do a temporary boost. Then we come to the Boss MD200. This, like I said, is a multi-effect, multi-modulation thing. It's way more modulation than I ever need. So I've actually just got this set up with 4 different presets. There's also a manual mode so I could dial something else in if I wanted. These are my 4 go-to things, and then I just add other things as needed. So on bank 1, I have a Leslie type effect. On bank number 2, I have a auto wah, which I use kind of like a filtery thing with a bit of gain. Could also use that for some sort of clean funk stuff. Basically just a bunch of quacky noises. The third one kind of like a uni vibe thing, so Hendrixy. Play that with a lot of fuzz or just for some kind of nice clean Hendrix stuff. And then the fourth bank is going to be the overtone mode, which is kind of like, it's not a Hammond organ simulator, but it kind of sounds that way. I really like this one because when I'm gigging, sometimes I just need to play like keyboard lines, and that's perfect because I can kind of get into those Hammondy organ sounds. It sounds really cool when you drive it a bit as well. That's a pretty fun one too. So that's the MD200. Mako D1, this is way more delay than I ever need. I've actually currently only got one preset set up in this, which is just like a slapback thing. Literally all I'm using that for at the moment. I can program in other ones, but I just haven't got around to it. Then the final reverb, the TC Hall of Fame Mini. This is literally just getting used for textural stuff at the moment if I just want more reverb. When I'm not taking my spring tanks, that is the one I'm going to be using. It's defaulted to like a spring reverb type, I think. I haven't actually updated the tone print in a while. Could be anything. But that would be my main reverb when I can't take my spring reverb tanks. So there it is. That is my brand new pedal board. So hopefully over the course of this video, you guys have learned basically how to put a board together, how to conduct your signal flow, how to power it, how to prep it, and everything else you need to have a great sounding pedal board. So for me, there's still a little bit of cleanup work left to do on this, but I'm happy with that. I'm happy with pretty much all the tones I've dialed in. There's still a little bit of tweaking I can do, but that is pretty much where I want it to be. So let me know down below in the comments what you guys think of my brand new pedal board, and hopefully you guys have taken some of the little tips and tricks away and applied this to your own pedal board building. Let me know down below in the comments what you think. Thank you guys so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the like and the subscribe button as well, and I'll see you guys very soon.